Hey, it's Mr. Solitano, and this video is going to explain average atomic mass versus mass number. So before we start, we really have to talk about the atomic mass unit. So chemists created a unit of mass to compare atoms called the atomic mass unit, which is given the symbol U, and it used to be called AMU, so it stands for atomic mass unit. We'll just be using U. So 1 U is the equivalent of 1/12 the mass of a carbon-12 atom. So think about that. An atom itself is already extremely tiny, right? 1/12 of that is going to be even tinier. But if you think a little bit more deeply about that, carbon-12 means that that's a carbon atom with a mass number of 12, right? So that means carbon's number of protons is 6, and that means this particular carbon atom also has 6 neutrons. 1/12 of those 12 total protons plus neutrons is basically the same as the mass of 1 proton or 1 neutron. So 1 U is considered the same as the mass, just about, of 1 proton or 1 neutron. So that's what we want to keep track of. So an atom of carbon-12 isotope contains 6 protons and 6 neutrons, so it has a mass number of 12. So that's really 12 U, essentially. Okay, so let's review mass number really quick. So before we said that the mass number is the number of protons plus neutrons, right? So here are a few isotopes of magnesium. And remember, the only difference between the isotopes is the number of neutrons. So here is 1 magnesium. This is magnesium 24. Here you see magnesium 24 because it has a mass number of 24. This is magnesium 25 because it has a mass number of 25. And this is magnesium 26 because it has a mass number of 26, because altogether its protons and neutrons give you 26. Now, the most important thing for what we're talking about in this video is that the mass number is only one single isotope, so one single atom. So in other words, the mass number of this particular atom is 24. The mass number for this one is 25, and the mass number for this particular magnesium is 26. So the mass number is only for one single instance of that particular atom. Just one atom, that's it. Okay. Now let's look at the atomic mass, which is actually very different. So a lot of you have been looking at the periodic table and thinking, what is this other number? This other number at the bottom that's a decimal is the atomic mass. So that's what you see on the periodic table. What you see on the periodic table is not the mass number. It's very different, and we're going to explain what it is. So the atomic mass is actually the weighted average mass of all the naturally occurring isotopes of that element that we know of, right? So it has decimals. It is not the mass number. So this is an average of all the isotopes of chlorine, for example. Now, so let's look at that for our magnesium that we were just looking at a minute ago. So our atomic mass, again, it's the weighted average of the atoms in a naturally occurring sample of the element. So it's based on the abundance in the world of that particular isotope. So for example, for magnesium, the most common isotope in the world, in fact 79% of magnesium isotopes, are magnesium 24. So each of those has a mass number of 24, 79% of them. And then 11% of magnesium will actually be the isotope magnesium 26. And 10% will be magnesium 25. When you take the weighted average of all those based on how abundant they are, the number comes out to 24.305 U. So this is what you would find on the periodic table. This is the average of all those isotopes. From now on, you want to say the average atomic mass. If you say average atomic mass to yourself all the time, it'll help you remember. So there's the mass number, and then there's the average atomic mass. Now this makes a lot of sense actually, because the vast majority of the magnesium isotopes are magnesium 24. So we would expect the average to be close to 24, right? Just like if most of your grades were about a 90, you would expect your average, your GPA to be about a 90, right? Same thing for this. And so if we look at, if two isotopes of one occur naturally, and each is 50%, and one of them is 100 U, right? So remember atomic mass unit U, and the other is 102 U, when the atomic mass of that element would be a weighted average. So if you look at the average, if we have 50% of the isotopes being 100 U, and 50% of the atoms being 102 U, so that's the mass number of half of them, then the average atomic mass would be 101 U. Now it's never going to work out this perfectly, right? It's always going to be a decimal. But that just gives you an example. This is the average of those guys. Okay, So given what we now know, look at this carbon atom from the periodic table, and looking at the average atomic mass here, what isotope of carbon is probably the most common in the world, that we know of? What is probably the most common isotope of carbon? Okay, so the answer is that carbon-12, right? So a carbon with a mass number of 12 is probably the most common of a particular isotope. Now, are there other isotopes? The answer is yes, of course there are, right? I mean, that's why the average is not exactly 12. In fact, because the average is not exactly 12, what can you determine about the other isotopes of carbon? So we can actually tell that the other isotopes must be higher because they're bringing the average up from 12, right? And we know actually that there's a carbon-13 and there's a carbon-14, right? Just like we said before, carbon-14 dating. So that is important. So summary, this is what you're going to be expected to know. So you're going to want to be able to complete this table. The mass number, is that going to be a decimal or a whole number? Well, remember, the mass number is just the number of protons plus neutrons, so that's going to be a clean whole number. The atomic mass, is that going to be a decimal or a whole number? Well, the atomic mass, which we call the average atomic mass, is an average, right? So that's going to be a decimal. The mass number, can you find the mass number on the periodic table? The answer is no, you cannot, right? The mass number is for a particular atom. The average atomic mass is what you do find on the periodic table because that's giving you the average of the entire element over there. So you find that decimal on the periodic table. That's the number that's there. Is the mass number only for one isotope, or is it for the element completely? The mass number is only for one isotope. And finally, atomic mass, average atomic mass, is that for the element completely, or is that for one isotope? That is for the element completely because we're talking about all of that known element. It's the weighted average of the whole element. Okay. So that's going to do it for us today. Thank you for watching, and remember, chemistry is everywhere.